There is a Chinese proverb, and it goes something like this: the person who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. What nobody tells you is who handed the first stone to the mountain mover. That question has haunted serious historians for decades, and the answer keeps pointing back to the same place, a place that most of the world has been trained to overlook: the Philippine Archipelago. Before the Spanish arrived with their crosses and their ledgers, before the word Filipino even existed, there were people here who built ships that could outrun the wind, who carried gold dust in their palms the way we carry coins today, and who funded empires they never got credit for building. This is not mythology. This is commerce, documented, traceable, and deliberately buried. Let's start with something that should be in every history textbook, but isn't. Around the 10th century, the South China Sea was not a territorial claim. It was a highway. And the traders who dominated that highway were not Chinese. They were the seafaring peoples of what we now call the Philippine Islands, the Luzonians, the Visayans, merchants from polities like Tondo, and the coastal settlements that predate every colonial map by centuries. These were not primitive fishermen trading shells for rice. These were sophisticated economic actors. They dealt in gold, beeswax, forest resins, and textiles. They extended credit. They maintained trade relationships across thousands of nautical miles. Here's what makes your hair stand up. The Song dynasty, which many historians consider the first truly commercialized dynasty in Chinese history, did not build its early maritime trade networks alone. It inherited them from relationships that were already old when the dynasty was young. Think about that. The infrastructure of Chinese maritime commerce in the South China Sea was, in significant part, scaffolded by traders who came from the archipelago. Filipino merchants, or the ancestors of what we now recognize as Filipino, were the logistical backbone of roots the Song emperors would later claim as their own achievement. And then the record gets edited. Here is the first case: the trading community of Tondo. Tondo is perhaps the oldest documented polity in Philippine history. Its existence is not legend. It appears in the Laguna copperplate inscription, the oldest known written document found in the Philippines, dated to 900 CE. The inscription is written in Old Malay with Sanskrit-influenced vocabulary and references debt forgiveness by someone of Tondo's ruling class. Debt forgiveness. Let's say, think about what that implies. You only forgive debt when you have the power to collect it. Tondo was a creditor society. These were people who were owed things. What historians have pieced together, carefully, from fragmented Chinese coastal records and the accounts of Arab traders who passed through, is that Tondo maintained active commercial relationships with Chinese coastal cities long before any formal tributary system existed. The goods flowing out of Tondo, gold, beeswax, aromatic wood, were foundational to the luxury markets that fueled early Chinese dynastic wealth. Foundational, not supplementary, not peripheral. But there's a detail buried in those fragmented records that almost nobody talks about. The credit arrangements. Philippine merchants didn't just sell goods, they extended seasonal credit to Chinese buyers. They absorbed risk. They were, in modern terms, venture partners in the earliest Chinese maritime economy. And when the Song dynasty formalized its maritime trade bureau, the Shibosi, it essentially nationalized a system of relationships that Philippine traders had built organically over generations. The system became Chinese. The history became Chinese. The people who made it possible became footnotes. Then they became invisible. Stop, just stop, and sit with that for a second. A people who helped architect one of history's great economic revolutions were written out of the story, not by accident, by a very deliberate process of administrative reframing. Now the second case. Let's say, and this one is even more extraordinary. In 1405, Zheng He launched his first great voyage, 7 ships of the treasure fleet. The world gasped, and China told a story about itself, a story of singular naval genius, of imperial ambition radiating outward like a sun. What that story omits is the pit stop. Multiple Chinese accounts, not Philippine accounts, not colonial accounts, but Chinese accounts, record that Zheng He's fleet made extended stops in the Philippine Archipelago. The fleet provisioned there, but provisioning is the boring word. What actually happened was more complicated. Local rulers and merchant communities in what is now the Visayas and Luzon region supplied the fleet with food, water, navigational knowledge, and local pilots who knew the sea routes southward. Navigational knowledge. Pilots. These were not gifts. These were transactions. The Chinese records acknowledge the exchanges in the language of diplomacy, which was the polite ancient way of describing commerce. But the underlying structure is clear. Without the support infrastructure of Philippine maritime communities, the treasure fleet's southern routes would have been significantly more difficult to execute. Zheng He got the monument. The pilots got nothing, not even a footnote in the Beijing annals. There is something almost painful about reconstructing this history. Because the Philippine side of it survives mostly in fragments, oral traditions, a few surviving trade documents, the interpretations of archaeologists who dig up Chinese ceramics in Philippine soil and ask the right question, why is all this here? The ceramics, by the way, are everywhere. Pre-colonial Philippine archaeological sites have yielded extraordinary quantities of Chinese trade ceramics, Song Dynasty, Yuan Dynasty, early Ming. The sheer volume tells you these were not occasional gifts or rare luxuries. This was sustained, high-volume, two-directional commerce. The Philippines was sending enough value outward to justify that volume of goods coming back. Value going out. To be honest, credits being extended, relationships being built. And then, nothing. The formal historical record of Chinese imperial archives treats Philippine polities as occasional visitors to the tributary system, not as co-architects of the system itself. Here's the pattern. Both cases show the same thing. When trade relationships were informal and mutual, Philippine merchants had power, real power, the power of creditors, of logistical experts, of people who knew the sea better than anyone. But the moment those relationships became formalized, folded into imperial systems, into tributary frameworks, into the administrative machinery of dynasties, the Philippine role was recast. They became recipients of Chinese civilization, beneficiaries of Chinese generosity. The dynamic flipped on paper. What actually changed was not the trade. What changed was the documentation. Imperial bureaucracies write history from the center outward. Everything at the periphery becomes passive, becomes a receiver. The active, powerful, credit-extending merchants of Tondo and the Visayan coasts were not passive. But the archive made them so, and here is something that should make every Filipino feel a specific kind of fury. Interesting fact, the gold, Philippine gold. Pre-colonial Philippine goldsmithing is among the finest in the ancient world. This is not nationalism talking. This is the Ayala Museum. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is the academic consensus of archaeologists who have studied the artifacts. The level of technical sophistication in pre-colonial Philippine goldwork indicates a society with serious surplus wealth. You don't develop that level of craft without economic stability, without accumulated capital. Where did that capital come from? From trade. From centuries of being very, very good at moving things across the sea and being paid well for it. Moving on. The gold that funded Philippine craft was, in a meaningful sense, the gold that earlier generations of Philippine merchants had earned from Chinese buyers. It circulated back. It built. it created the conditions for one of the ancient world's most sophisticated material cultures. And when the Spanish arrived and melted that culture down, literally melted the gold artifacts into bars, they destroyed the physical evidence of a civilization that had been commercially powerful for centuries. 2 layers of erasure. Chinese administrative reframing first, Spanish physical destruction second. What remains is enough. Enough to reconstruct the shape of what existed. Enough to say with confidence that the relationship between the Philippine Archipelago and early Chinese dynastic power was not one of grateful peripheral people receiving the light of civilization. It was a partnership. An unequal one in the end, yes. But at the beginning, at the foundation, it was built on Philippine ships, Philippine gold, Philippine credit, and Philippine knowledge of a sea that Beijing had to ask permission to cross. Now, the twist, because there is one. The Laguna copperplate inscription, the document that proves Tondo's sophistication, its debt economy, its literate administrative class, was not discovered by a Filipino historian. It was not discovered by a Chinese historian. It was discovered in 1989 by an antique dealer in the Philippines who thought it might be decorative metal. He sold it for the equivalent of almost nothing. Incidentally, the person who identified its significance was a Dutch anthropologist named Antoon Postma. A Dutch man had to tell the Philippines that the Philippines had a written history. Think about what that means. The erasure was so complete, the colonial miseducation so thorough, that an artifact proving Philippine civilization's depth and complexity, an artifact sitting in Philippine soil, was almost lost because nobody local was looking for it. Because they had been taught there was nothing to find. There is more to find. Archaeologists are still digging. Historians are still reading the margins of Chinese coastal records. Underwater archaeologists are mapping trade routes through the artifacts sitting on the floor of the South China Sea. Piece by piece, the picture is coming back together. To be honest, and every piece says the same thing. The mountain was moved by many hands. The person who got to stand on top and write the story of the climb was not the person who carried the first stone. That person came from islands the world has been systematically taught to underestimate.